That Wednesday morning in October, Pastor Caleb Pryor strolled into my courtroom like he already ran it, and I knew right away this day would be anything but normal. He looked like money from head to toe, tailored suit, heavy gold watch, rings that flashed every time he moved. In Providence, he was basically a hometown star, 4 churches, a massive campus with 3,000 seats, and a TV ministry reaching across New England. But he was not there for prayers or charity. He was there because of his son. 3 months earlier, Pryor's 22-year-old son, Dylan, had been arrested for drunk driving. Dylan had tested at 3 times the legal limit, smashed into a family minivan, and sent a mother and her 2 small kids to the hospital with injuries. Worse, he was driving on a suspended license after 2 prior DUIs. His father had thrown money at the problem before: lawyers, rehab, fixers, whatever it took to make trouble disappear. But this time, there was a witness with a smartphone who captured everything. 17-year-old Maya Lynn was driving her 7-year-old sister to ballet class when Dylan Pryor's BMW slammed into them at 60 miles an hour. Maya's spine was fractured, her little sister suffered a concussion, and the minivan was completely wrecked. And Dylan was so drunk he tried to drive off like nothing happened. Retired teacher Harold Bennett was stopped at a nearby light and watched the whole nightmare unfold. "That young man got out of his car," he told police, "and I could smell alcohol from 30 feet away. He was swaying, talking nonsense, and when he realized people were hurt, his first instinct was to get back in his car and leave. That was why Pastor Pryor was sitting in my courtroom, not for what he had already done, but for what he was about to try next. I walked in at exactly 9 o'clock, my black robe trailing behind me, and Maria already had my coffee waiting, strong and black. The courtroom was packed for a regular morning session. There were reporters from local stations, lawyers I recognized, and everyday people who had heard about the crash and wanted to see what would happen next. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Frank Caprio," Maria announced. As everyone stood, I noticed Pastor Caleb Pryor stayed planted in the front row, leaning in close with his lawyer, Grant Holloway, a sharp-dressed man from a firm that charged enough to feed a small army. Their confidence was loud, even without a word. "Dylan Pryor," I called, reading from the file. "Mr. Pryor, please approach the bench." The young man who stood was clearly his father's son. Same sharp features, same expensive clothes, and the same look that said rules were for other people. But where his father carried polished religious authority, Dylan just looked smug and spoiled. He walked up with the swagger of someone who had never been told no and actually had to live with it. "Mr. Pryor," I began, "you've been charged with driving under the influence causing serious bodily injury, leaving the scene of an accident, and driving on a suspended license. The minimum sentence for these charges is 4 years in state prison." Dylan's face drained of color fast. His lawyer leaned in and whispered something in his ear, like he could talk reality out of the room. Then Holloway stepped forward and said, "Your Honor, my client is willing to accept responsibility for this incident. We're prepared to make restitution to the victims and willing to accept responsibility." I cut him off immediately. "Mr. Holloway, your client tried to leave injured children at the scene of an accident. That isn't acceptance of responsibility, that's an attempted cover-up." That was when Pastor Caleb Pryor stood up, even though I had not called on him and had not acknowledged him at all. But there he was, speaking directly to me, like the courtroom belonged to him. "Judge Caprio," he said with that smooth, practiced preacher voice, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding here." "Reverend Pryor," I replied, "please take your seat. This is your son's hearing." "With all due respect, Your Honor," Pryor continued, still standing, "I think we need to discuss this matter privately, perhaps in my chambers." The entire courtroom went still. You do not ask for private meetings in the middle of an active hearing, and you definitely do not do it like that. This was not a polite request. It was pressure. "Reverend Pryor, please take your seat," I said. "The hearing will proceed as scheduled." But Pryor was not done. He moved closer to my bench, and I saw people shift in their seats as the tension spiked. "You do not approach the bench without permission." "Judge," he said, lowering his voice but keeping it loud enough for the first rows to hear, "perhaps we could discuss a more reasonable resolution to this matter." And then he did something that made my stomach drop. He reached into his jacket and pulled out what looked like an envelope, but it was not the envelope itself. It was the way he held it, the way he looked at me, and what he clearly expected it to mean. "Reverend Pryor," I said, cutting through the silence, "are you attempting to bribe a judge in open court?" The word bribe hit the room like a shockwave. People started murmuring, and some were already pulling out their phones. Even the court reporter froze mid-typing. "Judge Caprio," Pryor said quickly, "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Pastor Caleb Pryor said, trying to sound calm, but his eyes were jumping around the room. "Is that money in your hand, Reverend?" I asked, rising from the bench as the air turned heavy. "Are you trying to offer me money in exchange for leniency in my courtroom?" Pryor glanced around nervously, and his lawyer, Grant Holloway, leaned in and whispered fast, like he was begging him to put it away before it got worse. But Pryor had built his whole empire on making people believe he was untouchable, above the law, above consequences, and above basic decency. "Judge," he said, his voice turning steadier, "I think you're making a serious error in judgment here. I employ over 200 people. My ministries feed thousands every week. I have relationships with city officials, state representatives, and federal judges. I think it would be wise for all of us if we could find an amicable solution to this matter." "You employ people," I said. "That's good. You feed the hungry. That's also good. But none of that gives you the right to bribe a judge." "This isn't a bribe," Pryor insisted, even though the envelope was still plainly visible in his hand. "This is a donation to the court to support the judicial system that serves our community." "A donation," I repeated, staring at that envelope, "in an envelope during your son's criminal hearing." "Reverend Pryor, either you're incredibly naive about how bribery works, or you're incredibly arrogant about thinking you can get away with it." Now the courtroom was buzzing like a struck hornet's nest. Reporters were scribbling hard, some already texting their editors, and you could feel the story exploding in real time. I saw Harold Bennett shaking his head in disgust, and Maya Lynn's parents looked like they were about to cry, not from sadness, but from the sheer nerve of what they were watching. "Reverend Pryor," I said, standing again so there was no mistaking my tone, "you have 60 seconds to put that money away and return to your seat, or I'm holding you in contempt of court." 60 seconds? Pryor laughed, loud enough to turn more heads. "Judge, you really don't understand who you're dealing with here." "Oh, but I do," I replied, holding his gaze. "I'm dealing with someone who thinks money makes him above the law. I'm dealing with someone who believes his influence excuses him from basic rules of decency. I'm dealing with someone who thinks he can buy his way out of accountability." Pryor's face flushed red, and I could tell he was not used to being challenged. Not in public, not like this. He was used to being obeyed, used to getting his way, used to paying for the ending he wanted. "Judge," he said, his voice rising, "I think you're going to regret this conversation. I have resources you can't even imagine. I know people who could make your life very difficult." "Threatening a judge in open court," I said, keeping my voice controlled even as the room tightened around us. "Reverend Pryor, you just added obstruction of justice to whatever charges I'm going to file against you." "Obstruction?" Pryor looked genuinely confused, like he could not believe the word applied to him. "I'm trying to help everyone here. Your Honor, my son made a mistake, a young man's mistake, but that doesn't mean his life should be destroyed over it." "A mistake?" I could not believe what I was hearing, and neither could the people behind him. "Reverend Pryor, your son nearly killed 2 children, a 17-year-old girl who was just driving her little sister to ballet lessons. That child is probably going to need surgery, physical therapy, and years of recovery, and you call it a mistake?" I continued, letting the truth sit where it belonged. Pryor scanned the room like he expected sympathy, agreement, understanding, a soft landing. Instead, he found disgust and anger on faces that looked like their faith in justice was being tested right in front of them. "Mr. Pryor," I continued, "your son has 2 prior DUI convictions. This is his 3rd. The first 2 times, you paid lawyers to get reduced charges. The second time, you paid for him to attend a rehab program he probably never completed. But this time, there's a witness," I said. "This time, there are injured children. This time, there are cameras and evidence that can't be bought or bullied away." As I spoke, I noticed something that felt almost unreal. People who came to watch Dylan Pryor answer for his choices were now watching his father unravel in plain sight. The focus had shifted from the son to the father, from the crash to the corruption, from the crime to the nerve behind it. "Reverend Pryor," I said, "you have a choice. You can put that money away, return to your seat, and let this court process continue the way it should. Or you can keep up this ridiculous display of arrogance and learn the hard way that there are still some things money can't buy," I added, making sure every word landed. Pryor stared at the envelope like it had suddenly turned dangerous in his hands. He could see the stunt was failing, the cameras were rolling, and the record was building whether he liked it or not. "Judge," he said, finally lowering his voice, "perhaps we could discuss this matter more privately." "Absolutely not," I replied. "This courtroom is a public forum, and your attempt to bribe a judge is a matter of public record." And then Pryor made his final mistake. He threw the envelope onto the floor in front of my bench like he wanted the whole room to know he did not care. "Fine," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "If that's how you want to play this, Judge, then you're going to regret it. I have friends in high places. I have influence you can't imagine. I can make your life very difficult." Then he turned to the courtroom like he was about to deliver a sermon instead of face reality. "You're all witnesses to this judge's unfair treatment of a good man trying to help his family. He tried to paint himself as a good man being mistreated, like I was the problem and he was the victim. But the courtroom did not react the way Pastor Caleb Pryor expected at all. Instead of nodding along, people started shaking their heads. Some even laughed, because the whole performance was getting unbelievable. "Reverend Pryor," I said, "you just threw money on the floor of my courtroom and threatened the judge in front of witnesses with cameras recording everything." I stood up from the bench and looked him straight in the eye. "Bailiff, please escort Reverend Pryor from the courtroom," I ordered loud and clear. Officer Diaz, who had been posted at the back, immediately started walking toward him, but Pryor still was not done trying to take over the room. He shouted, "You can't throw me out. This is a public hearing. I have every right to be here." "Reverend," I said calmly, "you have the right to be here as a spectator, not as someone attempting to obstruct justice. You are being removed for contempt of court." As Officer Diaz reached him, Pryor tried to push past, acting like the rules did not apply to him. He yelled, "Don't touch me. I am a man of God. I am above this kind of treatment." "Reverend Pryor," I said, holding steady, "the only thing you're above is your own ego, and even that is coming back down to earth." And with that, the bailiff physically guided him toward the door. Even while being escorted out, Pryor kept trying to preach to the crowd like the courtroom was his stage. He called out, "You're all making a mistake," and "This judge is biased against successful people. He's biased against religious leaders." But then something happened that he clearly did not see coming at all. The courtroom started applauding, not everyone, but enough people that Pryor could hear it loud and clear. These were real people, not paid supporters, not scripted cheerleaders, just ordinary citizens who had watched someone try to buy justice and fail right in front of them. And the more he struggled, the more obvious it became that the stunt was not working. Once Pryor was finally removed, I looked around at the faces still inside the courtroom. They looked shocked, but they also looked satisfied, like they had just watched power get checked for once. "All right," I said, settling back into my seat. "Let's continue with Dylan Pryor's hearing." The young man sat frozen, his face pale with embarrassment and fear. Whatever confidence his father's money had given him over the years was gone now. He looked around and seemed to realize the only person who could help him at this point was the same judge who had just watched his father get hauled out. "Mr. Pryor," I said, "your father has just shown exactly why your family needs to learn some serious lessons about accountability." Dylan nodded weakly and answered, "Yes, Your Honor." "Your father attempted to bribe a judge in open court," I continued, making sure the record was clear. "He is now facing criminal charges that could send him to prison, but that is not your problem. That's his." "Your problem is what you did to Maya Lynn and her family," I said, keeping my eyes on him. Then I looked down at the file in front of me. "Mr. Pryor, you've been convicted of DUI 3 times, I said. This time, someone was seriously injured, and the victims are a 17-year-old girl and her 7-year-old sister. Maya Lin will probably spend the rest of her life dealing with the consequences of that night, I added, because that was the truth. Next to him, his lawyer was whispering urgently, like he was trying to rescue the situation with a deal. "Your Honor," the lawyer said, "my client is willing to accept full responsibility and make complete restitution to the victims." "Restitution," I repeated. "That's a good start, but what exactly do you mean by complete restitution?" "We propose a settlement of $200,000 for the family's medical expenses and pain and suffering," the lawyer said. $200,000 was a lot of money to most people, but for this family, it probably was not even a painful number. "Mr. Holloway," I said, $200,000 is a lot of money, but it's not going to fix Maya Lin's spine. It's not going to make her 7-year-old sister forget what it felt like to watch her big sister get hurt that night. It's not going to give them back the safety they lost in a single terrifying moment." I looked over at the jury box where the Lin family was sitting. They looked worn down, angry, and completely drained from months of medical bills and legal stress. "The Lin family has already spent over $50,000 on medical care," I continued, "and Maya needs surgery that will cost another $30,000. She'll need physical therapy for years," I added, "and the emotional damage to both children is something no amount of money can truly erase." You could feel the weight of that truth sink into the room. Dylan Pryor sat there staring ahead, probably wondering how his life flipped from being the son of a rich, powerful pastor to sitting in a courtroom with nowhere to hide. The reality was finally catching up, and it was not gentle. "However," I said, "I think there may be a way to handle this that deals with more than just the money. A way that hits the deeper problem that brought us here in the first place." The whole courtroom leaned forward because they were expecting me to come down on Dylan the way I came down on his father. They were ready for the harshest ending possible. "Mr. Pryor," I said, "you are going to prison. That part is not negotiable. Driving drunk on a suspended license causing serious injury and trying to leave the scene comes with a minimum 4-year sentence, and you earned it." Dylan nodded, because he already knew it was coming. His face said it all: fear, shame, and the understanding that the old tricks would not work anymore. "But I'm also ordering something that may surprise you," I continued. "For the next year, you will work with homeless shelters in Providence. Every day you're out on work release," I said, "you'll spend your time serving meals, speaking with homeless families, and learning what real struggle looks like." The courtroom went dead silent, because this was not the kind of sentence people expect to hear. "Your father," I said, looking straight at Dylan, "tried to use money to drag you out of this. He tried to bribe a judge, pressure a court, and use influence to bend justice. That mindset is part of what landed you here," I continued. "The belief that money puts you above the rules." Dylan looked confused, like he was still trying to figure out how the ground shifted under his feet so fast. He was finally seeing that the family name could not protect him in this room. "Mr. Pryor," I said, "your father is going to face criminal charges for bribery. He's going to lose his tax-exempt status, and he's likely going to lose his television ministry. Everything he built on a rotten foundation is going to collapse," I said, then paused so the meaning could land, and the pause felt louder than shouting. "But you still have a chance to rebuild your life the right way," I continued. "Instead of using your family's money to hide from consequences, you're going to use your time and your effort to help people who have nothing." The Lin family nodded as I spoke, because they understood what I was doing and why it mattered. They were not cheering, but they were listening like people who had been forced to become strong. "On top of that," I said, "you will write letters of apology to Maya Lin and her family every month for the next 5 years. You will explain what you did, how it hurt them, and what you're doing to make sure it never happens again." Dylan nodded again and said, "Yes, Your Honor." This time it sounded smaller, like the confidence had finally been stripped away. "And finally," I said, "you're going to donate the money you would have spent on a flashy defense to the Lin family's medical fund. Your father tried to buy your freedom, so now that money is going to pay for Maya's surgery and recovery instead. The courtroom started to murmur, because people did not expect this kind of turn. They expected punishment, and they were getting it, but it came with something else, responsibility that could not be faked. "Mr. Pryor," I said, "you will serve 4 years in state prison with eligibility for work release after 18 months. During work release, you will volunteer at homeless shelters, food banks, and soup kitchens throughout Providence. You will also write monthly reports about what you've learned and how you've changed," I added, keeping my eyes on him, because if he was going to rebuild, it had to be real. "This isn't only about punishment," I told him. "This is about transformation. Your father taught you that money and influence could rescue you," I said. "I'm going to teach you that real strength shows up when you help people who can do nothing for you." Dylan was crying now, real tears, not the kind people put on to play a judge. He said, "Yes, Your Honor, I understand." "The hearing is adjourned," I said, bringing the moment to a close, and the room felt different as people began to move again. 3 months later, I received a letter from Dylan Pryor. It was handwritten, not typed, and you could tell he had taken his time with every line. "Judge Caprio," it began, "I want you to know I've been working at the Providence Rescue Mission for the past 3 months. I never understood how many families in our city are one paycheck away from losing everything. I've talked to people who lost their jobs, people who lost their homes, and parents who are fighting just to feed their children," he wrote, and the way he described it made it clear he was seeing a world his money used to hide from. The letter kept going, describing day after day with homeless families and people who had almost nothing. He wrote about learning what real hardship looks like, up close, without filters. "I understand now why my father trying to bribe you was so wrong," he wrote. "I'm meeting people who would never even think about buying their way out of trouble because they simply can't. They face real problems, and they handle them with dignity and honesty," he wrote. And that line hit hard, because it sounded like a lesson he had finally earned. The letter ended with something that honestly surprised me. He wrote, "I'm learning the real test of character isn't how much money you have or how much influence you can swing. It's how you treat people who can't do anything for you." 6 months after the hearing, I ran into Harold Bennett at the grocery store. He recognized me immediately and walked right up. He said, "Judge, I wanted to thank you for what you did in that courtroom." I asked, "What do you mean, Mr. Bennett?" He said, "That day when the pastor tried to bribe you, I've watched this city for 60 years, and I thought corruption had won. I thought money could buy anything, but you reminded everyone that some things are still sacred." He paused, then added something else that stuck with me. He said, "I saw Dylan Pryor at the shelter last week. He was serving food to homeless families. And when a little girl spilled soup on herself, he helped her clean up without even thinking twice," Bennett told me. "That's not the same kid who drove drunk and tried to run away from injured children." "People can change," I said. "Sometimes it takes losing everything to understand what actually matters." 2 years after the hearing, Dylan Pryor came to see me again. He had been out of prison for 6 months, and he looked completely different. Not just physically, though he was thinner and looked older, but in how he carried himself. The arrogance was gone, and what replaced it looked like real humility. He said, "Judge, I wanted to thank you." I said, "Thank me for sending you to prison." He replied, "Thank you for not letting my father buy my way out of consequences. Thank you for forcing me to learn what real responsibility looks like. Thank you for showing me that helping other people is the only way I've found peace," he said. And it didn't sound rehearsed, it sounded lived. Then he pulled out a letter and said, "I wanted to give you this. It's from the shelter where I still volunteer twice a week. They wanted me to tell you I just helped a family find housing," he said, "and it felt better than anything my family's money ever gave me." That was the kind of sentence you don't forget. I read the letter, and it was from the shelter's director. It described how Dylan had gone above and beyond to help a family with children who had been living on the streets. It mentioned his patience, his compassion, and how serious he was about doing the work, even when nobody was watching. That kind of praise can't be bought, and everyone knows it. "Mr. Pryor," I said, "you learned something your father never understood. Money can buy plenty, but it can't buy character. It can't buy respect," I continued, "and it can't buy the quiet satisfaction of knowing you made someone else's life better." Dylan nodded and said, "Yes, Your Honor, I learned that the hard way." After he left my chambers, I thought about his father, Pastor Caleb Pryor. He was still in prison, still claiming he was the victim of bias and unfair treatment. He still couldn't accept the simple truth that his attempt to bribe a judge was witnessed by dozens of people, recorded by multiple cameras, and captured in public records. And that kind of evidence doesn't disappear just because someone wants it to. But Dylan understood now. He understood that real strength comes from helping people who can't help you back. He understood that real wealth isn't measured by what you own, but by what you're willing to give away. And he understood that the only way to earn respect is to show respect no matter who someone is. I'm Judge Frank Caprio, and after 40 years on this bench, I've learned that sometimes the strongest lesson isn't taught with words, it's taught with consequences. Sometimes the best judgment isn't only in a book, it's in your heart. And sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is refusing to let them buy their way out of becoming a better person. Thank you for listening, and God bless.